I've been working on an FPS game where instead of reloading, you steal loaded weapons from enemies. A lot of things have changed from the last devlog, but I figured I'd start out by talking about the new enemies. Two new enemies have been added. The first is the Tick, which was inspired by a little game called Titanfall 2, and the second is a drone with a SMG taped to it, which took inspiration from Among Us, both of which were modeled and textured by my friend Wills. The Tick is logically pretty simple. It chases the player around, and once it gets close enough, it explodes after a short countdown. The Tick can also be pulled and used like a grenade to blow up enemies. After being thrown, it will either explode on impact or explode in the air if the timer runs out before hitting anything. It also explodes when shot or when hit with a thrown weapon. The other new enemy mainly flies around and shoots at the player, but switches to ramming the player if its weapon gets stolen. Like the Tick, the drone will also blow up on impact, or blow up eventually if it completely misses everything. But unlike the Tick, the drone took a while to get up and running. The drone's movement uses a similar approach to the grounded enemies, in which a bunch of points are used to determine where the enemy should move to, but with an additional dimension. The way it works is that I generate a series of sample points within the volume of a box collider, and loop through a handful of points each frame to test conditions on. Any point that passes the conditions will then be marked as a potential position for the drone to fly to. Much like with the ground enemies, using this approach for the drones will prevent them from clumping together and allow them to flank around objects to attack the player. But an additional feature this provides is that the drones can be in a more comfortable position for the player to fight. This is because the drones will move to positions that have a small angle between them and the player, which prevents the player from having to look up too far when fighting them. However, getting the drones to move to the positions within the volume took a lot longer than I expected. My first attempt at getting the drones to move was to have them interpolate between the points, since this made stopping directly on the destination point easy to do. But the problem with this is that it looked terrible, and it made it difficult for the drones to change directions smoothly unless they made a complete stop first. So instead, the drones are given a velocity, and each frame an acceleration vector is added to it, so the velocity vector smoothly rotates to point at the destination position. Once the drone is headed in the right direction, I then calculate the acceleration needed to smoothly slow the drone down and come to a complete stop on the destination point. I then added a couple more things like tilting and bobbing to give it more realistic movement, as well as its attack logic. But just like that, the game now has drones. There have also been a lot of changes to the pre-existing enemies. The normal enemies got a bit of an upgrade and now wear khakis. Each of their weapons now have parameters that allow for a mix of single and full auto firing. This helps break up the attack pattern, since previously enemies would only shoot one bullet at a time, and often multiple enemies would end up sinking their attacks. I also decided to completely remove their last attack state, where after losing all their weapons they try to punch the player. The main reason being it was just too big of a pain to make it work in every situation. Each area of the level would then need to be structured in a way so that every spot was accessible by the AI in case they needed to chase down the player, which adds more restrictions onto the level design. But it will also make designing levels take longer and possibly result in different levels having similar designs. So instead, the normal enemies will just never run out of pistols. They just keep pulling them out of their ass. Which solves the level design issue, but I think it solves another problem as well. Since there would have been a limited amount of ammo on each level, if you're not as good as I am, there is a possibility to run out of ammo and having to die to restart the level. But if the enemies never run out of guns, then you can't run out of ammo. You see what I'm saying? Now you might be thinking, why not just add an ammo pickups like in every other game ever created? And to that I say, let's talk about the heavy enemy. The heavy enemy has changed quite a bit gameplay-wise from the last devlog. As a refresher, the heavy would start with the LMG that could be pulled by the player at any time. If the player decided to do so, the heavy would then pull out a shield and start shooting with its wrist gun. This didn't end up working well, since the player could steal the LMG right away, forcing the heavy into its second attack state, which was not very threatening. Without the LMG, the heavy essentially became a normal enemy with a bit more health. This also made them boring to fight, since the player didn't need to switch up their playstyle to defeat them. So the new redesigned heavy now starts with a shield that prevents the player from being able to pull the LMG. However, after the shield is destroyed, the player is then allowed to pull their weapon. Like before, the heavy will switch to its wrist gun, but it now shoots these plasma projectiles, which are slower than normal bullets, but also soft lock onto the player, which should help keep the heavy at a high threat level and offer a bit more diversity to the enemies. Alright, we're done talking about the enemies. Will has also made some arms, so I started working on first-person animations, all of which are still a work in progress, but currently there are animations for pulling, catching, and throwing weapons. The same pulling and throwing animations are used regardless of what weapon the player has, but each catching animation is unique since they all need to end up at a different position. There are also a handful of minor things, such as objects being pulled now follow a Bezier curve, which looks a lot nicer. Weapons that are being targeted now have their materials overridden to make it more obvious what object the player will pull. New and improved weapon models, hit markers, breakable glass where half the particles fall through the floor, and quite a lot of bug fixes. I also finally came up with a name for the game, which is Static Mag. The reasoning behind the name is since there's no reloading in the game, the weapon mags never move, hence they are static. I also just think it sounds cool. It was either that or Giovanni Goes to Pizza.